Get started here in just a second. So, a couple things off the top before we jump into some review. I moved that kind of last homework down, so that should be now factoring into your homework grade. So when you're playing around with that, figure out your grade tool. You should have kind of what your iClicker grade is with the lowest drop. You'll have your homework grade, your two exam, 1 and 2, and then you can kind of play around with that final. Let's see if I get this on the final or that in the final, what would my end result or my end grade be in the class? Okay. So the exam's going to be roughly what? Usually it's 20 questions in an hour. So we've got 2 hours. I believe our exam is Wednesday at noon. I don't want to mix up my classes here, so let me double check before I solidify that I'm telling you. Yes, yeah, I had this one right. Yep. So this one's Wednesday at noon. We'll kind of be here in class for 2 hours. So if usually we have 20 questions, I should give you 40, right? I'm only going to give you like 30. All right. So I think it'll be 30 multiple. Got it written. I think it's roughly 25 multiple choice and then kind of 5 true false at the end. They're not meant to be kind of overly difficult on those true false. Don't overthink them. True false being worth a little bit less than the multiple choice. But you should have time shouldn't be an issue at all. You should have more than enough time to answer that many questions. They'll look very similar to the types of questions you see in these 2 practice problems. I then said additional, if you want some more material to review, I'd go back through the notes or the lecture slides and look at those iClicker ones. So you can go here, and I might have not, oops. I'm now realizing I might have not uploaded the complete, oh yeah, we had additional topics. So I had the complete versions of the last couple classes where we're doing some additional topics in black markets. I then also have, here we go, kind of the complete lectures of the other weeks that we've looked at. So you can kind of go back through those, starting at game theory. So just these 2 sets of complete lectures, as well as the other ones that are kind of up there, not under the complete lectures folder. Look at those iClicker questions, kind of review, make sure you can get the correct answer on those for some additional practice. Okay. On top of that, I would go back through kind of the notes, anything you took notes on, just even, not reworking everything completely, but just kind of looking through it, kind of going into the exam. It'll be a nice refresher of kind of some of the things that we talked about. And I'll mention some of the things that might be really good to know kind of as we progress through today's class. Okay. Any questions for me, though, before we kind of get going too far into some of this review? So make sure you bring, shouldn't be anything crazy math, but bring a calculator. It's something to write with. I'll have extra paper. We don't have as kind of many equations like we did for the last one. The only equations we have today, I'll show you what they are, and I'll write them up on the board. Okay. So one of the first equations that you'll have, so I think we worked through this one 2 weeks ago on a Friday, where we kind of looked at these different quantities, right? And a different number of labor, hours or labor individuals, right? So the quantity of labor, quantity of this product. We talked about finding the marginal product of labor. We talked about finding the value of the marginal product of labor. Given a wage rate, how many workers would we choose to kind of hire? We kind of worked through a few of those. So we'll start out with this one to get a little bit of review, which is, let's think about I have this demand for labor. So we're going to be doing, since we did a lot of like game theory externality stuff on Friday in the review, but mainly focused today a little more on the labor market stuff that we went through. Okay. So we've got our supply of labor and our demand curve for labor. So we started out with a certain quantity and wage, right? Equilibrium. So this one says if demand increases for a firm's product, right? So we said the demand for labor is explicitly, so here I'm going to find DMPL. There we go. Is the value of the marginal product of labor that reflects a company's demand for labor, right? They'll pay up to, or their marginal benefit will be however many additional dollars that worker's additional output brings in. We said, how do we measure that? Well, it's the price of the product I'm selling times that worker's quality, right? Or their marginal productivity of labor, how many units they're adding. So if the price of the product goes up, so this is kind of the one equation I'll write up on the board, which is the value of the marginal productivity of labor is just the price of the times the marginal productivity of labor. So if the price of the good goes up, what's going to happen in the labor market for the workers who produce that good? Well, what's going to happen to their value of the marginal product of the labor? They're still just as effective as they were before, but now every unit they're making can be sold for a higher price, right? So we see this increase or rightward shift in our demand curve. Okay. And here, I should make this easier. It's not squaring it, but I'll just use like the superscript 2 to kind of indicate this is the second demand curve for labor after that change. Okay. So what's happened to the equilibrium number of workers? It's went up. And what's happened to the equilibrium wage? It's also. I could ask you the same thing, but what happens if the price of a product decreases? Well, there we would see a decrease in demand, which would push the quantity of labor and the wage down. Right? So it's just like when we had demand shifts in the product market, it's just now changes in the product market can then cause changes in our labor market. Okay? Questions on that one? So that's what, increase and increase? Or increase and more, I guess the way I phrase it. Any questions? Or with that? Shouldn't be too bad. That should be more of an easier one for the labor market. We'll then kind of focus on 5 and 6, which 5 has what? We're thinking about unions. Okay. So this kind of goes back to stuff we already talked about, right? It's just instead of a product market, we're looking at it in the context of a labor market. So we'll draw out kind of our basic labor market without a union first. We said if we have a union, right? So all these workers, the suppliers of labor, come together and act as one person. So we now only have one supplier of labor. When we had one supplier of a good, we called that a monopoly. Well, one supplier of a good was a monopoly, right? And we said, what did they do? Well, they'll make a decision on what the price of a good should be based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Well, the union now, one supplier of the good is labor, all right? They're the only producer, the only supplier. They'll make a decision about where should we set the wage for our union workers. We'll do that based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So actually, sorry, we'll call this quantity of the union. Before, we should have drawn this out ahead of time. We said if we just kind of have a perfectly competitive market, we would just have more supply and demand intersect as our equilibrium. But after we see this union, they'll target a lower quantity of workers, but they know at that quantity that companies will be willing to pay up to whatever their benefit is or the value of the marginal productivity of labor. So at this quantity, the union knows they can get away with asking for higher wages. And this is one thing, like as you're approaching the exam, I think one nice thing about economics is like when we're talking about things like unions, like there's an intuitive result you probably have already heard mentioned before we even went through something. So in general, like if you hear the word union, well, what's the whole point? They want to increase worker wages. Now, when we draw the model out, we remind ourselves of that, but like going into it, like we should kind of have this idea, like if I do this and I'm like, okay, here's the wage that the union would set. Right here where the marginal revenue and supply are going to set. I'll look at this and be like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Unions shouldn't lower wages, right? Oh yeah, I forgot. That's how I identify the equilibrium quantity. I then go up the demand curve to know how much firms would be willing to pay, right? What they pay, the price to a firm is wages. Does that make sense? I think if there's anything else I want to say here. So we get, with a union, a lower number of workers, but a higher wage. So we've got what? This would increase the equilibrium wages, but result in fewer workers being employed. I will see a reduction in the quantity. Any questions on that one? Yeah,
What would the opposite happen? What if they deunionize or something?
Yeah, so let's say, I don't know, for some reason, they come in and they break up the union, right, like that, I mean, which isn't like, usually it's not the government doing that, it's just natural causes the union kind of either dissolves. It would be the exact opposite, right, because I'm starting out at this point now. So if instead the union dissolves, well, now I was here, once I have a perfectly competitive market, the number of people employed will actually go up, but the wages will go down. So it would just be the exact opposite effects. It's just like you're starting from a different reference point. Right? Probably won't ask you that, but if I ask you something, it'll be like if we have a union relative to the perfectly competitive. We usually try, and I usually do on the exams, we kind of use our reference point as this perfectly competitive, like that we assume like if we're starting out here, the only way we get away from this point is if the government steps in or if we have some type of market power issue. So we're always usually thinking about this allocating this perfectly competitive point is kind of our reference. Okay. That's a good, you're thinking good though, like, well, how can it change things? And you know. Any other questions for you? Can keep going. Now, it might not ask you to calculate it, but what's something that, as a result of this union, what's something else that's happened in the market? Yeah, right. We actually have this area where we say unions actually create this deadweight loss. So let's instead assume that we've got some monopoly power. There's a reason unions exist, and we said, yeah, okay, it looks like they're bad, right? Oh, they deadweight loss, right? But they usually start up because there was some really bad work condition, because there's really one major employer, right? So we said when there's one major employer, we can think of this as not monopoly power, like the union has, but monopsony power. This isn't very common in a product market where you only have one consumer of a good. You know, I don't know, like I said, give some examples of like maybe NASA used to be the only consumer of spaceships or something like that. But in general, we don't see many examples. But in the labor market, there's often regional monopsonies, right? There's one major employer, especially if we start to look at sector by sector, right? If I live in Muncie and I want to work for a hospital, unless I want to take off and drive quite a way, it's like I have one hospital I can work at. If I want to be a surgeon at the hospital, it's kind of my only choice. So they've got this monopsony power, which we say, okay, with monopoly power, we had like the union making a decision based off a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. With monopsony power, it's going to be based off a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, twice as steep as the supply curve. Right? So it's just kind of on the opposite side. One producer, twice as steep marginal revenue curve on demand. One consumer, twice as steep marginal expenditure curve relative to the supply curve. So now what is the optimal? Well, also should start it out. Here was our perfectly competitive equilibrium. Now that we've got this monopsony, they're going to choose, well, where does my marginal expenditure hit that demand curve? And the whole reason why here is when I have influence over when I'm the only employer and I have influence over the wage, I can think about it as like my marginal cost. I'm now making this based off of like an average marginal cost or this marginal expenditure. Okay? You don't have to kind of dive too deep into that, but that's the general idea. It's a little bit harder to think about in the marginal revenue. But once we identify this quantity, right? So this was going to be the quantity of the monopsonist. Well, we don't just simply set the wage higher. Once again, let's use kind of some intuition. If we just set the wage here, okay, so we went from having multiple employers to only one. Now that one firm has a bunch of market power, they're going to charge a higher wage. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? They have kind of all the bargaining power now. Oh yeah, just like when we had union power, you don't set the price at that point. You set the price or the wage at wherever the other party is willing to pay. Well, we know that workers are willing to supply their labor at this quantity for a much lower wage, right? So this was the idea that once we have a monopsonist or one employer, they're going to have some power over that market and they're able to pay lower wages. Once again, what do we have as a result of that? All this surplus from all these workers now no longer being employed. is now gone, right? So we have some deadweight loss. You've seen a reduction in the number of workers and a reduction in the wage. So the union and the monopsonists actually have similar effects on the number of people we see employed, right? Both of them drove the quantity of workers down. It's just they had opposite effects on the wage. Okay. Any questions there? And I won't combine those two on the exam, so you don't have to worry. I think I might have worked through an example in class where I kind of combined the two. I'm not going to expect you to combine the two. Just knowing the individual effects of a union and monopsonists here. Yeah.
So what would be the answer for that?
Oh, what do we have? So we've got deadweight loss of 0. That one's not true. So automatically, this is probably a little easier than working through the whole model. I worked through this just in case I asked you a slightly different question. Right, the equilibrium wage paid to workers is higher. Actually, I think I have multiple, but that one's not true either. The equilibrium number of workers will be lower. That's true. The consumers of labor will set wages. I must have a typo in there. So that's a very good question. It should have to be.
My A says deadweight loss is positive. Not 0.
Well, that would be why I uploaded an earlier, or I have one earlier version on my Google Drive. I probably realized that was wrong, updated, right? So now if that instead, when I posted, said that deadweight loss is positive, well, we know that's the case, right? We have some deadweight loss that exists, so it must be that the equilibrium wage is higher. That one's the only one that's not true. Thank you for asking that. I didn't realize mine didn't match up with the one I posted. Does everybody understand that? So the one I posted did not say deadweight loss is 0. I changed it, realized that before I posted that the answers didn't make sense. So if we hadn't said A being the deadweight loss is positive, we know that one's true. We know that the equilibrium number of workers will be lower, so C is true. Consumers will set wages, right? We have one consumer of labor now, so that's true. The only one that's not will be higher. We compare the wages as well. Any other questions on that one before we keep moving? Okay. So I think we worked through this one, correct? A couple weeks ago, we were talking about determining kind of what percent of overall income, like different quintiles own. Now, one thing we talked about is this J coefficient. I'll have to go back a ways. Probably won't ask you to do a lot of calculations with it, but I might ask you a very similar question like I have here, which is about directional changes. So if we had this kind of percent of people, right, these different quintiles of our population, and when we have percent of wealth or percent of all the income that existed in our economy, we said, what would a perfectly equal world look like if we graphed out what percent of the people own what percent of wealth? So we look at the bottom 20%. We had a perfectly equitable society. What percent of overall wealth would the bottom 20% have? Everybody's earning the exact same amount. That's our perfectly equitable society. Every single quintile would have the exact same percent, right? So the bottom 20% would own 20% of the wealth. The bottom 40% would own 40% of the wealth, right? This would kind of continue until we get up to this point. Where we're at 100 hundreds, and we have this line of quality, right? This perfect line, of equality, right? Which represents that every single percentile of people are earning the exact same percentile of the overall wealth. Okay. So this was kind of our comparison group. We then said, okay, in practice, what do we actually see? We see this Lorenz curve, right? At the bottom 20% of people might only make 5% of the overall wealth, right? And then as we kind of get closer and closer to the top, they're earning a much higher percent. So you can think about this blue line here. This is what we were calling our Lorenz curve. And it kind of represented how unequal the income distribution in our society was. As it got closer to like looking like a right angle, we said that was getting a more and more unequitable society, right? But then as we get closer and closer to this 45-degree line, we're getting closer and closer to having perfect income equity or perfect kind of income equality. So this Gini coefficient, we said, let's see here, where's the so which one's not true? So we've got, how do we measure this? So it was going to be the area under our Lorenz curve, right? Divided by the total area under the line of perfect equality. So it was almost like, what would the line of perfect equality be? Well, actually, I think this one also we have what? 4 zeros, so 10,000. So that area would actually always be 5,000, but you don't necessarily need to know that. We just need to know that our denominator is always going to be the area under that line of perfect equality. So if you draw kind of a nice visual, okay, I've got this society, it's not perfectly equitable. How unequitable is it? Well, the area under that curve relative to the area under a scenario where we had perfect equality, that's going to represent my Gini coefficient, right? So the higher that is, right, the more equitable society I have. So think about it this way. If my line starts getting closer and closer to this line of perfect equality, what happens when it's exactly equal to that? Well, now the area under my curve, my Lorenz curve, is the same as the area under the line of perfect equality. So I'd have a Gini coefficient of 1 if I had kind of a perfectly equitable society. And then as my Lorenz curve gets closer and closer to like bending down towards that point, the area underneath it's going to get closer and closer to 0. In fact, if I had a scenario where only one person owned all of the wealth, I would have a Gini coefficient of 0. So this line, so the Gini coefficient is the area under our Lorenz curve divided by the area that would be under the curve if it was specifically equitable. The closer that ratio gets to 1, the closer we're getting to a perfectly equal society in respect to income. As it gets closer and closer to 0, we're getting further away from that point. All right, so an economy with a perfect equality is a Gini coefficient of 0. That makes sense. Perfect inequality, coefficient of 0. That one also makes sense. The closer it gets to 0, the more economic inequality exists. So that's what we just were saying here, right? As I get a more unequal society, it's getting closer to 0. So hopefully the only one that isn't true now is D, which is the closer the Gini coefficient is to 1, the more unequal the society, or not society, more income or economic inequality exists. Well, if I'm getting closer to 1, I'm actually getting closer to perfect equality, not inequality. So that's the only one that doesn't make sense. So I'm not going to make kind of do calculations with this Gini coefficient, but I will expect you to know kind of how to interpret it. Thinking about the extreme, right, the 1 to 0, might be something that's pretty similar to a question like this. Maybe I changed like what is true, and I, certainly. Questions? Well, I might be doing a little fast because I'm trying to get through as much as I can because I want you guys to do very well in this exam, especially for those of you who have showed up today. So, got something else that I want to go through, which is this last one. So I think probably the fewest. I went through an example in class, but I probably have mentioned this the least. So I wanted to make sure I worked through one that looked similar to this. Now here I left this as kind of a short answer question. Like I already mentioned, that I don't give you an answer or kind of put you that far in the exam, kind of keep it multiple choice. I think that helps in my experience with the grades and things. So, but this is how we would work it out, right? Now, kind of maybe hopefully along the way see multiple choice questions that could be asked. So let's say I've got the supply of labor is identical for individuals over the age of 45 and under the age of 45. Assume that workers under the age of 45 have higher education and skills than those over 45. Use a graph to depict the equilibrium wage and number of workers that differ between younger and older individuals. Again, basically just restating this. So let's think about the scenario that we have. We've got this labor market. And we're going to think about, here I've got my demand curve. Oh, sorry, not my demand curve. My demand curve down here. My supply curve for older and younger individuals. Okay, we said we're going to assume that's the same, right? We're going to assume that's the same just to make this a little bit easier to identify. Well, then what is the difference in kind of skill levels, right, or education for one of the groups? How is that going to change in this labor market? So let's say here, I just start out putting my older individuals. So I'm going to identify where their equilibrium number of workers are and their equilibrium wages, okay? If my younger workers, right, we've got the same supply, but if my younger workers have a higher level of education, what do you think is going to be true about their demand curve relative to the older individuals? It's going to be higher. Why? Because remember, the value of the marginal productivity of labor, which is if we're in the same market, we're producing the same goods. If I get higher education or higher skills that I increase my marginal productivity of labor, well, then companies are going to be willing to, right? Or, you know, I'm bringing more money to the company, they're willing to pay me a higher amount of money, right? So with a higher level of education or skills, right? I actually think this is relevant. I'll kind of maybe mention here in a second. I would actually expect younger workers to have higher wages and see more of them employed, right? Because they're more valuable to these companies, right? They have higher level of marginal productivity of labor. Right? Now, when I say education or skill here, this is like really relevant for any industry where you kind of need to keep up on or could have an advantage from having like internet, social media skills, right? You see a lot of the older workers don't have that. And so your younger workers might have the same level of education, right? They have the same bachelor's degree from the same university in accounting or whatever it is, economics, finance, but they have an understanding of how to also then display that or kind of use the tools that exist now, social media, whether or not it's kind of setting things up on a website that maybe some of my older workers don't, they're more valuable to my company. So I'm going to see them actually get higher wages and then higher number of workers being employed there. Everybody understand that one? Okay with that one? So that's something we kind of did go through. Here's what maybe we did, right? It could make this a little bit harder, right? And it's on, we've got the effect of one thing here. So I'm going to write that down first. Anytime we have the two simultaneous things going on, we want to analyze the effect of each, okay? So here we saw this demand for younger people be higher. That resulted in what? Higher wages for younger individuals, but also a higher quantity. So now let's say at the same time, and I can draw in the same graph in a second, but I'll show you why it's important I maybe draw them out separately. Let's say at the same time I know that just based off of the demographics of my society, I have fewer younger workers, right? So maybe the age cut off to make a little more sense. Instead of 45, maybe I chose like 30, right? A very young age. So that for whatever reason, the way I cut this, I can think about individuals maybe under the age of 30 to make this maybe a little more realistic, are the ones really who have these additional skills, right? So I'm going to start out, and then we'll say, okay, let's assume that that's the only difference we have, right? That if younger and older individuals have the same skill level, that the supply of older workers is much greater than the supply of younger workers. If that's the case, what's true about the supply curve for younger workers? It's lower, right? There's fewer of them. So that supply difference caused us to see all these points, right? So we've got the older workers quantity is right here, older person's wage is right here. So just the supply difference, right? We're kind of thinking about if we had the same skill level, right? So the way I might phrase this on an exam or a question is, let's start out, assume that you have a lower supply of workers, while at the same time, lower supply of younger workers, while at the same time, you expect those younger workers to have a higher skill level or higher education. What's the end result? Well, I've already looked at what happened when they're at a higher skill level. But when they have a lower supply, that pushes their wages up. So the supply decrease caused the wages for younger individuals to go up. But it also caused the quantity of these younger workers to go down. Not intuitive, right? There's just not as many of them. So now what's the total effect if these things happen simultaneously? Well, what did both of these effects do? Yeah, my supply decrease increased wage, and my demand increase, right, from these higher skill levels increased wage. So I can say with 100% certainty, wages of younger individuals are going to be higher, right? So if I'm thinking about, say myself out of room, it's hard to write down there. So my total effect, or the combination of these two things, I know that younger workers will have higher wages. But am I going to have more younger workers employed than older workers? Well, they're both pushing the quantity of those younger workers in opposite directions. So here we would say the change is indeterminate, right? I can't say whether or not the number of younger workers is going to be higher or lower. And the reason why it's important to kind of, if you have simultaneous changes, draw them out separately. Watch what can happen if I draw them out in the same graph. So I've got my demand shift here. Let's say I just drew a really small supply being lower or supply decrease for these younger workers. Well, where does the demand and supply curve for my younger workers now look like? It looks like it's way up here, which is greater than the number of older workers. But if I had drawn a really large supply, maybe that quantity should have actually been lower, right? So if I draw them simultaneously, it'll depend on how large the shifts are, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? If I had a really small supply shift, the demand shift causing the quantity of younger workers, didn't write it down, so hold on. This caused, we'll go errors here. If the demand shift was much larger than the supply shift, right, a really small supply shift, well, then that's going to be the effect that, where is that? There we go, wins out. If the supply shift is really large relative to this demand shift, well, then the supply shift is going to win out, which is pushing the quantity of workers to be low. Right? So drawing these out separately, kind of then writing down what does that demand difference do for the wage and the quantity of workers? What does that supply change do to the wage and the quantity of workers? And then if they're both pushing something in the same direction, well, then I know that that's either going to increase or decrease. If they are pushing something, the same thing in opposite directions, that's where I say the change is going to be indeterminate. It's like when we had simultaneous supply and demand shifts with the problems. That's probably the most complicated, one of the most complicated questions that you would see is if I give you these kind of two simultaneous shifts, right? But knowing how to do them each individually, those might be kind of standalone questions as well. All right. Any questions on that before you keep moving here? Sound good? All right. So I think was an interesting example that kind of can hit some of the stuff we talked about and give those of you who are here today maybe a little advantage. So one thing we talked about last week was this idea of black markets, right? So I'm not going to go through every single model because I'm not going to be expecting as much knowledge about those. But one thing I might want you to know, and I'll kind of give you a nice synopsis here, all right? So let's see if we can kind of recall just from the discussion, and I might draw a little bit just to kind of quick, you don't have to copy it down and give you a justification for why or just a reminder. But what are some things that we said could cause there to be a black market that exists? Probably the easiest one is if, so that's the one I was thinking of, but yeah, hopefully I'm glad that's the most important one here, the most obvious one. But I would say taxes, right? Well, why? We said because taxes, right, push that supply curve down, push the price up relative to what it was before. Now there exists maybe some opportunity if I go, behind, legal means. I might be able to kind of. There's people who want to buy, but only at lower prices and with tax results in. Right? So that was one of the things. What was another thing? The taxes increased prices. another thing that might increase the price. We said government can set, I think someone said it. Price floors, right? Basically just imposing a price floor up here, pushes that price up, the same kind of thing exists. There's now a range where people would be willing to buy at a lower price, who are kind of pushed out of the market, but if they can do so kind of behind the scenes without risk of getting caught, they might buy on the black market now. Okay? And the third thing that we kind of looked at, and this is, I thought, this was maybe the easiest one, but maybe not, I guess we're thinking really economically, but we said, what would you think before using this class? If I said black market, you're probably thinking about what kind of goods? Drugs, right? Illegal, right? So illegal goods, right? So illegal drugs, illegal firearms, whatever it is. So that illegality really had the same effect. We said, if it's illegal, usually there's these huge fines imposed or jail time on producers, which will kind of push that supply curve back, driving the price up. If they want to sell these things, maybe through legal means, right? If you sell illegally, you don't get all these additional regulations, you don't, then we're going to have this issue. So these are kind of the three things we said can drive black market, at least that we talked about. So price floors, taxes, then kind of whether or not we impose some punishments for illegal goods. Okay? And we actually said taxes, really, you could also think of as synonymous if you added like regulations that had additional cost in producing things too. So maybe the question in the exam might be, which of these things causes black markets, or which of these things doesn't? These three should be ones that do. Whatever the fourth one I decide to include is, should be the one that does not. So knowing that these three things can cause black markets is all I kind of expect you to know. But I think kind of walking through the labor market effects of some things for the black market is helpful, and just the general labor market stuff we've been talking about. So I was thinking about how do we kind of combine, because I only gave you black market examples where we had goods. Okay? Let's think about now, what if I had a labor market? So, okay, here's this demand for labor, here's my supply for labor. Well, what's one of these three things? So you just kind of indicate where we start out at. We're a perfectly competitive market. What's one of these three? I can't really make like there's actually a couple different examples, but which of these maybe would kind of push? There's you can actually I'll give you an example of each one. Right? So what's a tax that could potentially kind of cause some changes in my labor market? Every job you work, if you look at your paycheck, what happens? It's lower, right? So income taxes are going to kind of decrease the supply of labor. Okay? So what happens, right? That's going to push the wages that workers want to make to be higher, and the new people are going to be higher. And now you can think about anywhere here. Well, if you pay me this higher wage, it's essentially like I'm only making this much. Right away, you give me $500, I only get to keep, 300, whatever it is. So what might you look for a job, or what kind of job might you look for? Not one that has, I might look for an all cash job, right? Not one where I get like a nice W-2 statement. I might be looking to get paid under the table. Because if I get paid under the table, I no longer have this income tax. So I would actually accept any lower wage here because it's actually not lower. Right? I'm keeping all of it as cash. So when we have these kind of income taxes, we're actually causing there to potentially be a black market for labor. Right? I don't know. So that's one thing we think about. It's like the same thing as we were talking before, a tax on these goods, right? It's essentially like you're decreasing the labor supply, pushing that wage up, now creating this opportunity for a black market to exist. What's an example? And we talked about this one a long time ago. But because we've been talking about things like price ceilings recently, what's something else that could push the price specifically of lower wage workers up? People want it to be $15 an hour now. Yeah, minimum wage. So let's think about if we had something like this, right? And let's say there's an industry and we've got, here's my minimum wage. And maybe this is $15 an hour. Previously, maybe the wage was something like, I don't know, even if it was $10 an hour, right? So because I've imposed this minimum wage, this price ceiling, what's happened, I've increased the price of labor, which has also kind of reduced the number of workers that I have. This minimum wage has pushed the wage up, but it's also decreased the number of people getting jobs. So this is kind of the adverse effect. If you keep your job, awesome, but you might lose it, right? So all these people in between here, these are people who still want to work if you pay them any wage in this range, right? So what might happen if we have minimum wages, same kind of idea, instead of legally paying workers this minimum wage, maybe, and this adds another wrinkle, but we assume the costs are relatively low to kind of shipping goods. Instead of hiring US workers at a minimum wage, what might I do? Go overseas where I can pay people $2 an hour, right? Because if I know that there's people out there in the world who are willing to work, I put 10 here, but they're willing to wait for a much lower wage, I'm essentially kind of like black market labor market. Now, if there's no regulation, we wouldn't probably label it as like it's a, going against any laws or anything, but that's really what it is. It's a black market for labor that's outside of the US. Then the other things we did taxes, we did, if I make hiring certain workers illegal, so you can't, this one's not, I don't know, this one's rare, but it also applies. If I make it illegal for like employing someone under the age of 14, we said that effect is like, I'm adding this cost if I get caught from employing these 13-year-old kids, right? Or 12, however young they are. So what do a lot of younger, at least I did this when I was 13, 14. I looked for jobs that I was paid cash, right? Black market. I mean, black market has like this negative connotation, but it's just you're looking for ways to earn this wage, right? That, yeah, it's a little bit lower than whatever that legal wage would be, but you're willing to work for it. So as long as, we have these kind of government actions that are causing the wage to be higher, right? Then we're going to see some of these black markets exist. Now, no matter if that's making it illegal to hire certain workers under a certain age, whether or not that's income taxes, whether or not that's kind of imposing some of these price floors like minimum wage. So trying to draw these things that we've talked about over the semester together, right? There's a lot of the controls we talked about, but just kind of in the context of the labor market. So what are some tips I might have or some things I want to say? So obviously we went through a lot of labor market stuff today. It's going to be a big majority of the exam. You kind of think about half of it's going to be kind of this labor market, additional topic stuff that we talked about a little bit. Like I said, mention a question, maybe you're going over black markets, maybe review the stuff that we talked about in terms of like skill differences, men and women, or all these different things. With the additional topic slides. And that was really like just shifts in our demand curve for labor. We're just using specific examples. And then the first half is going to be more of this, like some of the game theory stuff we looked at. So make sure you know how to set up those normal form games, solve them, extensive form games, where we do kind of the solve for the second mover first, then the first mover, and then also the externality stuff, right? What fixes negative externalities? We remember. If I have a negative externality, the negative externalities, we actually want to push the supply curve back. So we said we tax them, and then positive externalities, subsidies, right? When we talked about some other things, price floors or price ceilings that could be used in those scenarios. So maybe kind of reviewing that discussion, what would be beneficial as well. Okay. Any other questions from you? So if I can ask you guys to do one thing, is me getting salvage, but there's a lot of stats courses here. I always like to use this example. You could write your name on the way out. And then you're going to kind of look at the correlation between attending review sessions and performance on exams. I'm guessing I know what the correlation is, but I'm just kind of getting you at the game here so I can kind of look and see what that correlation is and use that to my platform. All right. All right. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.